The Germans' Kriegsmarine had a phrase for British destroyers in the early months of World War II. Blechbüchsen tin cans. It wasn't meant as a compliment. These vessels, weighing around 1,400 tons and armed with 4.7-inch guns, seemed laughably fragile compared to Germany's heavy cruisers that displaced 10 times their tonnage and carried 8-inch armor-piercing shells. The mathematics of naval warfare appeared brutally simple. A destroyer encountering a heavy cruiser was expected to flee or die. German naval doctrine, refined since the First World War, emphasized the overwhelming advantages of armor, firepower, and displacement. Their officers trained on the principle that ship classes existed in strict hierarchies. Destroyers screened for capital ships, cruisers hunted destroyers, and battleships dominated everything. The Royal Navy understood these same principles. Of course, British destroyers were designed for speed, torpedo attacks, and convoy escort work, not slugging matches with armored warships. Their thin hulls could be penetrated by shells that would barely dent a cruiser's belt armor. But doctrine and mathematics don't account for human decisions made in seconds of crisis. They don't factor in the variable of a commander who refuses to accept what the textbooks say is inevitable. The Germans called them tin cans because they genuinely believed these ships posed no serious threat in direct combat. That contempt was about to be tested in the cold waters of Norway in a way no one anticipated. The spring of 1940 found the Kriegsmarine preparing Operation Weserübung, the audacious plan to invade Denmark and Norway simultaneously. Admiral Raeder had convinced Hitler that Scandinavian ports were essential for Germany's naval strategy, providing access to the Atlantic and denying Britain forward bases. The operation would deploy virtually every major surface unit Germany possessed, including the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, a modern warship commissioned in 1939, armed with 8 8-inch guns and 4 turrets, capable of 32 knots, and protected by armor belts up to 3.1 inches thick. Against this formidable vessel, the Royal Navy had dispatched HMS Glowworm, a G-class destroyer completed in 1936. She carried 4 4.7-inch guns in single mounts, measured 323 feet in length, and her hull plating was thin enough that heavy machine gun fire could potentially penetrate it in places. Her primary weapons were her 10 21-inch torpedo tubes and her speed of 36 knots. In the tactical calculus of 1940, Glowworm existed to deliver torpedoes against enemy capital ships, preferably at night, then escape using speed and agility. The idea of closing to gun range with a heavy cruiser, let alone physical contact, violated every principle of destroyer tactics. Yet within days, this tin can would challenge the entire premise of naval hierarchy in a way that would force even her enemies to bear witness to what happened. Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roope took command of HMS Glowworm in 1939, bringing with him a reputation as a capable and determined officer. At 35 years old, Roope had served in the Royal Navy since his teenage years, working his way through the ranks with a methodical professionalism that earned respect from his crew of 146 men. He wasn't known for recklessness or heroic pronouncements. His service record showed a commander who followed orders, maintained discipline, and understood the technical capabilities of his vessel. Glowworm herself was part of the first destroyer flotilla assigned to the home fleet operating from Scapa Flow in Scotland's Orkney Islands. The early months of 1940 had settled into a frustrating routine for destroyer crews. The anticipated massive naval clashes hadn't materialized, replaced instead by the grinding work of convoy escort, submarine patrols, and the constant North Atlantic weather that tested ships and sailors with equal brutality. In early April 1940, British naval intelligence detected increased German naval activity, though the full scope of Operation Weserübung remained unclear. The Admiralty ordered multiple destroyer groups to sea, tasked with reconnaissance and interdiction patrols off the Norwegian coast. Glowworm received orders to join the battlecruiser HMS Renown and other destroyers in laying mines in Norwegian waters near Vestfjord, part of Britain's effort to disrupt potential iron ore shipments from Narvik to Germany. The mission seemed routine enough, the kind of operation destroyers had been executing for months. Roope prepared his ship and crew for departure, ensuring fuel bunkers were topped off, ammunition lockers fully stocked, and all mechanical systems functioning properly. The 4.7-inch guns were tested, the torpedo tubes inspected, and the ship's Parsons geared turbines brought up to operational temperature. On April 6, 1940, Glowworm departed Scapa Flow as part of a small task force, steaming northward into deteriorating weather conditions. The North Sea in early April is notoriously treacherous, cold, gray, and prone to sudden storms that can reduce visibility to yards and turn routine operations into tests of seamanship. By April 7th, the weather had worsened significantly. Heavy seas battered the destroyers and spray froze on exposed metal surfaces. Roope and his officers maintained their position in the formation, but the conditions strained every aspect of shipboard life. Sailors worked in wet cold. Equipment required constant attention to prevent freeze damage, and navigation became a matter of dead reckoning when visibility dropped to near zero. The task force pressed northward through the night, unaware that they were steaming almost directly toward the German invasion fleet. Admiral Hipper, commanded by Captain Zur C. Helmuth High, was at that moment leading a group heading for Trondheim, carrying 1,700 German troops. The two forces were on a collision course, though neither knew it yet. What happened next would be determined not by grand strategy or naval doctrine, but by a single moment of human vulnerability. A sailor falling overboard in rough seas and a commander's decision about whether to turn back. The evening of April 7th brought conditions that made every movement on deck hazardous. Waves crashed over Glowworm's bow, and the wind shrieked through the superstructure with enough force to knock a man off his feet. Visibility had collapsed to perhaps 100 yards in the driving sleet and spray. Around 2000 hours as the crew worked to secure equipment that had broken loose in the violent motion. A sailor was swept overboard by a wave that crashed across the deck without warning. The shout went up immediately, "Man overboard." In these temperatures, it meant minutes at most before hypothermia rendered rescue impossible. North Sea water in April hovers around 6 to 8 degrees Celsius, cold enough to induce cold shock response within seconds and unconsciousness within 15 minutes, even for a strong swimmer. Roope faced an immediate decision that every naval commander dreads: continue with the formation toward the operational objective or break off to search for one man in darkness, heavy seas, and near-zero visibility. Naval doctrine was clear on this point. The mission takes priority, especially during wartime operations when breaking formation could endanger other ships or compromise operational security. A single sailor's life, measured against strategic objectives and the safety of the entire crew, represented an equation with a predetermined answer. Many commanders would have maintained course with genuine regret but clear conscience. Roope gave the order to come about. Glowworm turned back into the storm, her crew scanning the black water for any sign of the lost sailor. The ship's searchlights cut through the darkness, illuminating driving rain and thrashing waves, but little else. For hours, through the night of April 7th and into the early morning of April 8th, Glowworm conducted a search pattern, crisscrossing the estimated area where the sailor had gone overboard. The engineering crew maintained revolutions that gave the ship steerage way without overshooting potential sighting positions. Lookouts braced themselves on the pitching deck, eyes straining against the elements. The sailors' chances diminished with each passing minute, but Roope continued the search. By dawn on April 8th, the reality became unavoidable. The man was gone, claimed by the North Sea like thousands of sailors before him. Roope ordered a course set to rejoin Renown and the other destroyers. But the night's search had carried Glowworm significantly off her original heading. The storm had also scattered the British formation. Glowworm was now alone, approximately 100 miles northwest of Trondheim, attempting to navigate back to her assigned position using dead reckoning in conditions that still limited visibility severely. The ship's radio crackled with encrypted signals, but communication with the main force remained intermittent. What Roope couldn't know was that his decision to search for one sailor had placed his ship directly in the path of Admiral Hipper and her accompanying destroyers, which were approaching the Norwegian coast on schedule for the invasion's opening moves. At approximately 800 hours on April 8th, 1940, lookouts aboard Glowworm spotted dark shapes emerging from fog banks ahead. The shapes resolved into warships, German destroyers running at speed. Roope ordered action stations, and Glowworm's crew rushed to battle positions they had drilled 100 times but never used in actual combat. The German destroyers were Z-11 Bernd von Arnim and Z-18 Hans. Ludemann, modern vessels from the Type 1934A class that were escorting Admiral Hipper toward Trondheim. Their lookouts spotted Glowworm at nearly the same moment, and both groups went to action stations within seconds. Roope's tactical situation was immediately complex. He'd encountered enemy warships in Norwegian waters, which provided crucial intelligence about German movements that needed to reach the Admiralty. But transmitting a contact report would reveal his position and invite attack, while his operational orders required him to investigate and engage enemy forces where possible. The German destroyers had already turned toward Glowworm, and their 5-inch guns outranged his 4.7-inch weapons slightly. In terms of raw firepower and numbers, this matchup favored the Germans, but destroyer versus destroyer combat often came down to seamanship, gunnery accuracy, and tactical decisions made in seconds. Roope ordered Glowworm to increase speed and maneuvered to keep the range open, while his radio operator transmitted an urgent contact report. The message went out at 8:15 hours. Enemy destroyers sighted. Position approximately 64 degrees north, 5 degrees east. The German destroyers opened fire first, their shells throwing up towering splashes as they found the range. Glowworm's guns responded, the sharp crack of 4.7-inch shells punctuating the roar of the wind and sea. The engagement developed into a running fight with both sides maneuvering violently and firing as opportunities presented. Roope demonstrated the seamanship he'd honed over nearly 2 decades of service. Using Glowworm's agility to throw off German ranging solutions, shells screamed overhead or exploded in the water close enough to drench the deck with spray. The range fluctuated between 8,000 and 12,000 yards as both formations maneuvered for advantage. After several minutes of this exchange, Roope made a decision based on tactical logic that seemed sound in the moment. The German destroyers were trying to bracket him, using their numerical advantage to force him into a kill zone. His best chance of survival and escape appeared to be breaking through, their line using superior speed and then making for open water where he could potentially lose them in the weather. He ordered maximum revolutions and turned directly toward the gap between the German vessels, laying a smokescreen as Glowworm accelerated. The engineering crew pushed the Parsons turbines to their limits, and the destroyer surged forward at over 35 knots, her bow smashing through waves and throwing spray high into the air. The Germans fired into the smoke, but tracking a target moving at that speed through artificial fog strained their fire control systems. For a moment it appeared Roope's gamble would succeed. Then at approximately 900 hours, Glowworm burst through her own smokescreen, and Roope saw what was waiting on the other side. The massive gray hull of Admiral Hipper loomed ahead, her 4 twin turrets training toward the destroyer that had just appeared at point-blank range by naval combat standards. The heavy cruiser displaced 14,150 tons fully loaded, more than 10 times Glowworm's displacement. Her 8 8-inch guns could fire 270-pound shells capable of penetrating significant armor at ranges exceeding 16 miles. Her secondary armament of 4.1-inch guns matched Glowworm's main battery in number and nearly in caliber. Everything about the encounter screamed retreat. But Glowworm's momentum had carried her to within 6,000 yards, and Admiral Hipper's guns were already firing. The first salvo from Admiral Hipper's main battery passed overhead with a sound like tearing fabric amplified 1,000 times. 8-inch shells displacing massive amounts of air create a distinctive roar that sailors who've experienced it never forget. The shells exploded in the water beyond Glowworm, throwing up geysers of white water taller than the destroyer's mast. Captain High aboard the German cruiser had been surprised by the sudden appearance of a British destroyer, but his crew had trained extensively, and their fire control systems were among the most advanced afloat. The second salvo fell closer. Roope's options had collapsed to essentially none. Running was futile. Admiral Hipper could maintain 32 knots in these seas, and her longer hull and greater displacement gave her better seakeeping ability than a destroyer being pounded by waves. The cruiser's fire control could track targets out to the horizon, and her shells could reach Glowworm regardless of evasive maneuvers. Surrendering wasn't an option Roope appears to have considered, even momentarily. The only possible action was attack, regardless of how suicidal the mathematics appeared. Roope ordered his gun crews to engage Admiral Hipper directly while simultaneously preparing torpedo tubes for launch. The 4.7-inch guns barked their defiance, shells arcing toward the heavy cruiser at maximum elevation. Several struck home. Witnesses aboard Admiral Hipper reported hits on the superstructure and one shell that penetrated near the waterline, but 4.7-inch shells carried 50-pound warheads designed to damage destroyers and submarines, not penetrate heavy cruiser armor. They could kill exposed personnel and damage unarmored sections, but they couldn't inflict critical damage to a warship built to withstand 8-inch gunfire. Meanwhile, Admiral Hipper's third salvo achieved a straddle, shells landing both short and long, meaning the next salvo would likely hit. The German gun crews were finding their target. At 0905 hours, an 8-inch shell struck Glowworm's forward section, penetrating the thin hull plating and exploding inside. The blast killed several crew members instantly and started fires that spread despite damage control efforts. Another shell destroyed one of the 4.7-inch gun mounts, turning metal and men into fragments. Glowworm was being systematically torn apart by weapons she couldn't effectively counter. Her torpedo crews managed to launch several fish, 21-inch Mark 9 torpedoes capable of delivering 750-pound Torpex warheads that could break a cruiser's back if they struck home. But firing torpedoes at a maneuvering target in heavy seas from a ship being hit repeatedly demanded luck as much as skill. Admiral Hipper's helmsman threw the cruiser into hard turns, and the torpedoes passed harmlessly by, their wakes visible in the gray water. The engagement had lasted barely 15 minutes, but Glowworm was dying. Fires burned out of control in multiple compartments. The forward section showed serious structural damage. Casualties mounted as shell splinters scythed through exposed positions. Roope had been wounded by shrapnel but remained on the bridge, still directing his ship's increasingly desperate defense. From his vantage point, he could see Admiral Hipper clearly now, the massive cruiser dominating his view, her guns flashing as they fired again. Standard doctrine called for breaking off, attempting to escape into smoke or weather, preserving what remained of the crew. But Glowworm's damage made escape unlikely. She was slowing. Her steering had been compromised, and Admiral Hipper showed no signs of letting her quarry escape. In these circumstances, naval tradition and Roope's own understanding of duty pointed toward one final action that might at least inflict damage worthy of Glowworm's sacrifice. He ordered full speed directly toward Admiral Hipper's hull, the order to ram. The engineering crew responded to the order without hesitation, coaxing maximum revolutions from turbines already strained by combat maneuvering and battle damage. Glowworm turned toward Admiral Hipper's starboard side, her bow swinging onto an intercept course as shells continued to impact around and upon her. Roope's decision wasn't born from panic or desperation alone. It represented a calculated final tactical choice. His ship was mortally wounded and sinking by degrees. His crew faced death whether Glowworm went down from gunfire over the next 10 minutes or immediately from collision. But ramming offered the possibility of inflicting genuine damage on an enemy capital ship, the kind of damage that might affect German naval operations for months. A destroyer's bow, even one as lightly built as Glowworm's, carried tremendous kinetic energy when driven at 30+ knots into a stationary or slower-moving target. Steel hull meeting. Steel hull at that velocity could breach compartments, flood magazines, and potentially cripple even a heavy cruiser. Aboard Admiral Hipper, observers watched with mounting alarm as the British destroyer's intent became clear. Captain High ordered emergency maneuvers attempting to swing his cruiser's bow away from the oncoming threat. But Admiral Hipper's greater mass meant slower response to helm orders. The cruiser was mid-turn when Glowworm closed the final 1,000 yards. German secondary batteries poured fire into the destroyer at point-blank range. 4.1-inch shells and 37mm anti-aircraft guns firing directly into Glowworm's superstructure and hull. Men died at their posts, hit by shells or crushed by collapsing structures. Fire consumed the forward sections. The bridge area took multiple direct hits, but momentum and the sacrifices of the engineering crew kept Glowworm driving forward, through damage that should have killed her propulsion systems. Sailors who survived the ramming later reported the feeling of unreality in those final seconds. The massive gray wall of Admiral Hipper's hull growing larger, the scream of incoming shells, the knowledge that death was seconds away. Impact came at approximately 0920 hours on April 8, 1940. Glowworm's bow struck Admiral Hipper's starboard side at a shallow angle just aft of the bridge structure, hitting at an estimated 25 to 30 knots. The sound of the collision carried. Across the water, the shriek of tearing metal as Glowworm's bow crumpled and rode up along the cruiser's hull. The destroyer's forward momentum drove her sideways along Admiral Hipper's flank for several seconds, her port side grinding against the cruiser's starboard plating. Glowworm's anchor, still secured in its hawse, tore a long gash through the German ship's hull, plating as the vessels scraped together. The physics of the collision were brutally one-sided in terms of which ship suffered worse. Glowworm's bow was completely destroyed, crushed back into her forward compartments. But Admiral Hipper's hull, designed to resist torpedo hits and shellfire, couldn't entirely withstand the focused force of several hundred tons of steel driven against her at ramming speed. When the vessels finally separated, Admiral Hipper bore a 130-foot gash along her starboard side, extending below the waterline. The breach opened multiple compartments to the sea, and water flooded in at a rate that immediately threatened the cruiser's stability. Her starboard list became pronounced within minutes. Damage control parties scrambled to shore bulkheads and activate pumps while Captain High assessed whether his ship could continue toward Trondheim or needed to abort the mission. For Glowworm, the ramming was fatal. Her bow completely destroyed, fires spreading throughout her length and flooding accelerating from multiple hull breaches. The destroyer began to settle rapidly by the head. Roope gave the order to abandon ship around 0925 hours. Sailors who could reach the deck jumped into the North Sea's frigid water. Many were already dead at their stations. Others were trapped below as compartments flooded. Glowworm capsized within minutes of the abandoned ship order, rolling to port as her forward sections filled completely with water. The stern rose into the air briefly, propellers still visible above the surface before the entire vessel slid beneath the waves at approximately 0930 hours. From ramming to final sinking, barely 10 minutes had elapsed. Over 100 men entered the water, most without life jackets due to the speed of the sinking and many already wounded from the battle. The North Sea showed no mercy. The same 6 to 8 degrees Celsius water that would have killed the sailor Roope turned back to search for now threatened to kill his entire crew. Hypothermia begins affecting judgment and motor control within minutes in water this cold. Strong swimmers become weak, then unconscious, then dead within 15 to 30 minutes without flotation or rescue. Aboard Admiral Hipper, Captain High faced his own crisis. The 130-foot gash extended well below the waterline, and seawater poured into multiple compartments despite damage control efforts. The cruiser had taken on a pronounced list of approximately 5 degrees to starboard, and flooding continued. His orders were to land troops at Trondheim as part of the coordinated invasion, but continuing with this level of damage risked losing the ship entirely if conditions worsened. The immediate tactical situation also demanded attention. Glowworm had transmitted contact reports before engaging, which meant Royal Navy forces knew German warships operated in these waters. More British vessels might appear at any moment. Yet despite these pressures, High made a decision that speaks to the traditions of seafaring that transcended national conflict. He ordered Admiral Hipper to heave to and commence rescue operations for Glowworm's survivors. German sailors threw lines and lowered nets over the cruiser's side. Lifeboats were launched despite the risk this posed to Admiral Hipper's combat, readiness, and the continuing threat from British forces. The German crew pulled British sailors from the water, many barely conscious from cold exposure, others injured from the battle. The rescue efforts continued for approximately 45 minutes, during which time Admiral Hipper remained essentially stationary and vulnerable. 40 men from Glowworm's crew of 149 were saved, pulled aboard the German cruiser and immediately provided medical attention, warm clothing, and hot drinks. The Germans worked without distinction between their rescued enemies, treating wounded British sailors alongside their own injured crew members. Several survivors later reported acts of particular kindness. German sailors giving up their own dry clothing, medical personnel working to revive men who appeared dead from hypothermia, officers ensuring prisoners received the same rations as the crew. Lieutenant Commander Roope was seen in the water by multiple witnesses from both ships. Several accounts describe him helping other sailors reach rescue lines despite his own wounds and exhaustion. The Germans threw him a line, and some reports indicate he initially grasped it. But whether from wounds, hypothermia, or exhaustion, he lost his grip and slipped beneath the surface. Other attempts to reach him failed. Gerard Roope drowned in the North Sea on the morning of April 8, 1940, age 35, having commanded his ship for barely a year. His body was never recovered. Among those who died, with him were 108 other crew members, men whose names are recorded on naval lore memorials but whose individual stories of courage in those final minutes remain largely unknown. Admiral Hipper eventually limped away from the scene, her damage control parties having stabilized the flooding enough to allow movement. But the ramming had consequences beyond the immediate tactical situation. The cruiser required immediate repairs and couldn't continue to Trondheim. She diverted to Germany, effectively removed from the Norway operations opening phase. The 130-foot gash required weeks in dry dock to repair properly, time during which one of Germany's most powerful surface units sat useless while the Norwegian campaign continued. The tin can had bloodied the Predator badly, enough to matter. The sinking of HMS Glowworm received little immediate attention in April 1940. The Norwegian campaign exploded into full-scale operations within hours of the engagement, and British forces faced catastrophic defeats across multiple fronts. Newspapers focused on the German invasion's shocking success, the fall of Denmark, and the desperate British attempts to hold Norway. A single destroyer lost in combat seemed almost routine compared to the scale of events unfolding. The 40 survivors entered German prisoner of war camps where they would spend the next 5 years. The story of what happened off Norway that morning might have faded into the countless footnotes of naval warfare, except for an extraordinary act by the enemy commander who had witnessed it. Captain Helmuth High, while still commanding Admiral Hipper, filed official reports that included detailed accounts of Glowworm's action. His reports described the ramming attack and Lieutenant Commander Roope's conduct with professional respect rather than propaganda dismissiveness. But High went further. Through neutral channels using the international conventions that still functioned even during total war, or forwarded testimony to the British Admiralty specifically recommending that Roope be recognized for his actions. German officers praising enemy commanders for awards was extraordinarily rare, particularly in the ideologically charged atmosphere of the Second World War. High's testimony described Roope's tactical decisions, his refusal to surrender despite impossible odds, and the courage required to order and execute a ramming attack. The testimony reached London through Switzerland, where it was verified and entered into official British records. The wheels of naval bureaucracy ground slowly, particularly during wartime. Recommendations for the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military decoration for valor, required extensive documentation and witness testimony. Roope's case presented unique challenges. Most witnesses were dead or in German prison camps. The action occurred in confused circumstances without other British vessels present, and verification depended partly on enemy accounts. The Admiralty investigated throughout 1940 and into 1941, interviewing survivors as they could be contacted through Red Cross channels, examining Admiral Hipper's damage reports obtained through intelligence sources, and reviewing Glowworm's transmitted messages from April 8th. The picture that emerged confirmed High's assessment. Roope had engaged superior forces despite having legitimate options to withdraw, had fought his ship effectively against overwhelming firepower, and had made a final attack that damaged an enemy capital ship at the cost of his own life and most of his crew. On July 6, 1945, more than 5 years after the action and 2 months after Germany's surrender, the London Gazette announced the posthumous award of the Victoria Cross to Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roope. The citation read in part, "For valor in challenging hopeless odds and giving his life to damage a major enemy unit." His widow received the medal, a bronze cross cast from Russian cannons captured in the Crimean War, attached to a crimson ribbon, Britain's highest recognition of military valor. Roope's name was added to the relatively short list of naval officers awarded the Victoria Cross during the Second World War, only 14 in total out of hundreds of thousands who served. The medal resides today in the Imperial War Museum, a small bronze cross representing one morning's defiance in Cold Day. Northern waters, the engagement's tactical significance extended beyond one ship's sacrifice. Admiral Hipper's removal from the Norwegian operations opening phase affected German naval deployments and reduced the heavy covering force available for the Trondheim landings. British analysis of the action contributed to evolving destroyer doctrine, particularly regarding situations where breaking off engagement might be impossible or where ramming represented a viable final option. The Royal Navy published internal studies examining Glowworm's gun handling, damage control, and tactical maneuvers during the engagement, using the action as a case study in destroyer combat against superior forces. Training programs incorporated lessons about maintaining offensive action even when tactically overmatched and about the psychological impact of aggressive destroyer tactics on enemy commanders. But perhaps the deepest legacy lies in what the action revealed about the nature of courage and the refusal to accept predetermined outcomes. The Germans called British destroyers tin cans because mathematical analysis of armor, displacement, and firepower suggested these vessels couldn't threaten major warships in direct combat. The analysis was correct in purely technical terms. A destroyer shouldn't be able to damage a heavy cruiser significantly, and attempting to do so should result in the destroyer's quick destruction with negligible impact on the cruiser. Glowworm's crew and commander acknowledged none of these calculations. They fought with what they had, used every weapon and tactic available, and when death became inevitable, they ensured it counted for something. The 130-foot gash in Admiral Hipper's hull represented the mathematical impossibility made real through human will. It demonstrated that courage and determination could at least occasionally overcome material disadvantage, so extreme that doctrine said fighting was pointless. 78 years of subsequent naval history have produced faster ships, more powerful weapons, and combat decided by missiles launched beyond visual range. Modern destroyers displace more than the heavy cruisers of 1940 and carry firepower Roope couldn't have imagined. But the fundamental question the action poses remains relevant. What do you do when the mathematics say you've lost? When doctrine says withdrawal is the only rational choice? When survival requires accepting defeat? Glowworm's answer was to fight anyway, to ram the predator with the tin can and to prove that the Germans' dismissive nickname missed something essential. Tin cans aren't supposed to sink heavy cruisers, but on April 8, 1940, one did.